Welcome to my naming conventions video. So let's just start off with some naming conventions themselves, which are just rules that you should follow that, and if you can ignore them, you won't get an error or anything, but they're just better to follow because they just help your code be a lot more organized and neat. So some and these are conventions for naming variables, functions, and classes. So the first one is you should not have the first letter in your be a capital unless it's a class, then it's fine. And if you want to make a constant of any of those, you should make it all in capitals. So then technically it's fine there. But otherwise, you're making a function or a variable, you should never have the first letter be a capital because it just isn't good. The second one, this is pretty obvious, but your variable names should reflect their purpose. This is pretty obvious. It just helps your code be a lot easier. And another one is if you want, this is more just like a little tip. If you want to, since you can't, I'm going to talk about it in a second, but you can't use spaces, use an underscore capital letter in the middle of your of your variable name to represent a space, because you cannot normally use a space in a variable, function, or class name. And also, just keep in mind that variable names are capital sensitive. So for example, this is just my code right now, but if I did a hi equal 1, and I said print hi with a lowercase, it says unresolved reference because it's capital sensitive. But then I changed that to capital high. We're all good. So that's just a little example. So yeah, that's more of a rule, but yeah. Now these are actual rules that, unlike the first like conventions, if you don't follow these, you'll get an error. So make sure to follow these. So the first one is that it can't start with a number. You can't have your thing like you can't have any of a class function or variable's name start with a number. And as I mentioned earlier, they can't have spaces in them. You also can't have them be the same name as a Python keyword, and you can't have any irregular characters in the variable name, like at all. It's not like the numbers. For example, so let's just do a number one. So like 1 pass equals 2. Like look, it's getting really confused. So you just can't do it. But if I did like, I, we're 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 good. So yeah, that's just a little example. Now onto some general tips when organizing your code. I'm not gonna show my code. I'm not gonna show you how I organize my code yet. I'm gonna do that in a second. But when organizing your code, you should have all your variables declared in one spot. I usually the top. That's where I prefer it. And you should make sections of your code all like work together. Like you should make like if some sections are working together, you should make them near each other so they all accomplish the same thing. This is very important because it can give you errors if you're using like loops and if statements, but you should use consistent indentation. And as I said earlier, it can give you errors and it also makes it a lot easier for other people to understand just at a glance. Because if you have like inconsistent indentation, it can be very hard to understand. Also, including comments can be helpful in our code. I use a few to help just show what my code's doing. It's a lot. Comments are very useful, especially if you're in a group. I think I just put them in because it helps me understand them, even though I'm not in a group. But I'd recommend using them because it makes it a lot easier for you to understand your code and also a group, especially if you're in a group. I would highly recommend using comments. And even if you're using functions, which I'm going to talk about in an actual second, I recommend still using them just in case other people want to look at your code to to see if they can take inspiration or something, and they can just tell from a glance. And yeah, and I would also, and if you're working in a group, I'd very highly recommend, which I'm going to talk about organizing and functions, which I think you should always do. But in a group, I'd highly recommend always organizing the in your code and functions because you can help separate the work a lot easier. Thanks to just make people work on specific functions that you want to assign to them. Unlike if you didn't have functions and you would have to assign them to like blocks of code and it'd be a lot more annoying than if you were just to assign them to their own specific function. Now on to how you can organize your code and functions, which I feel like you should always do. I originally didn't do it because I didn't really understand functions, but now that I do, I always code in functions like my FBT, anything since the first functions project. I've always coded in functions because it's just a lot easier to use, a lot easier to understand and use the code. Because if you want to make a game start screen, it's a lot easier to just use functions because instead instead of doing a huge if statement that covers the entire thing, you could just do an if statement that calls a function name. But that's just a little what I like to use functions. Now, the way you organize functions usually is that you should, at the top of your code, have all the variables that aren't in functions, all your variables that you want to pass into functions that you want to be in all your functions at the top, and also any import statements. I should have said that any import statements. The same up for up here. You should always have your import statements at the top along with variables, and then your code in the middle, or the middle and bottom in this case. And then this is the same here though. In the middle, you should have all your functions, and at the bottom, you should be where you call all your functions because you can't. I don't think you can call functions before they're declared. I think you can, but it's just a lot easier to do it if you do it below. And yeah, and though, but you also really don't have to do much organization with functions because if you use them, they're already organized once you make functions. And yeah. And also, as I said earlier, just make sure to name your functions because that also helps organize your functions a lot. Now on to how I organize my code. Now I started by organizing at the top by importing, as I said earlier, what you should do, all my modules and pre-built functions. Why do I have an error? Oh, forgot to I don't know. Oh, my bad. Yeah, but up here I just have all my modules, functions, and classes, including Pygame, which is the big package, and then sys, random, and then datetime. Then we have the initialization of Pygame, and then down here we have all my variables. Then in the middle, I organized, as I said earlier, you should do too. I organized all my functions. You just keep looking at all my functions, including the game loop. These I'm gonna actually move. I'm gonna move up here. I forgot about that. I'm just gonna move these up here because I should stick them with all the variables. I forgot about those. And yep, so all my functions, while loop, all my functions, and it's just all functions. And yeah, so you want to organize all your functions. Now if you wanted to call them through normal means, you should probably just call them at the bottom. But I use lambda in a very weird way. So yeah, but that's just I use a different way, but you should normally have all your stuff at the bottom. That's how I'd recommend organizing them. And yeah. And I think that's it for my video. Yeah, and also I do follow the convention of naming everything after what it does. Like for example, my pipe variable, like let's just do the pipe gap. That equals 200, and that is the pipe gap. Same thing here, the minimum height. You should do this. This is just a way you should organize your code. Always do this. I did it, and I don't see why you wouldn't. It just makes your code a lot harder. And yeah. And I don't even like there's like specific conventions, like camel case. I don't use that. I just use underscores as the space, and this is just my entire game, and that's how I organized it. So thank you very much, and goodbye.